My name is Audrey Cooper. I'm the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle, and welcome to the latest installment of our Chronicle Chats. A few things I wanted to announce to everybody so you know what's on our docket for the rest of the year. We have one more Chronicle Chats event, official one, coming up on December 4th. We have tickets on sale right now. I'm very excited for this one. It's about immigration and the arts community in San Francisco. And we're going to have some performances on it. It will be a really interesting conversation. But even more interesting than the conversation is beforehand, I was just told today that we're going to have a mixer with some of our Datebook columnists and critics before the event. So, all of you who have a problem with Mick LaSalle's movie reviews, you get to tell him in person whether you agree with all of them or not. So that'll be, mark your calendars, that's December 4th. We're also going to have an event, we haven't nailed down the details yet, but leading up to the election, we're envisioning it as an actual live voter guide. You can come, we'll explain to you the pro and cons of every measure and what all the candidates stand for in San Francisco. And we're gonna come out with some details of that pretty soon too, so that will be very exciting. For any of you who have not been to a Chronicle chat before, I always tell people that I think it's our job at the Chronicle to provoke civic discourse and to really inspire some new ways of thinking about the world. And that is definitely true with our topic tonight. You know, the reporters in the newsroom, they have this saying that news is what happens to editors. They say this because when we come up with a story idea, it's usually like, well, I was coming to work and I saw this thing and I think it's a story. So this is their way of brushing off ideas that editors have. But this is literally one of these things that happens to editors. I think it's part of my job to be as public-facing as possible. When you email me, I will email you back. If you tweet at me, I'll tweet you back. And I have to say, this year I did something that for me, having this POV, this idea of how a modern-day editor should react to the public, was pretty radical. And I took Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of it off of my phone, because I found what I was doing at night was checking my Twitter feed, and all of those trolls, I was reading them in real time as they were complaining about me, and it affected my psyche so much. And I have to tell you, after I got rid of it, my whole life has changed, and I've really thought a lot about what is it that compels us to post things? What is it that's compelling us to be slaves to our phones? I left mine at work and I freaked out and asked 5 people at the office if they could find it in my office. Something has happened in the last couple of years that has changed how we interact with each other, how we interact with technology, and how we are viewing the world. And so that's one of the things that we're going to discuss tonight. Now, normally, I'm the moderator for the conversation. We started discussing the programming for this event with my number 2, who is managing editor, Fernando Diaz. And he was so excited about this that I had this epiphany that I could spend a lot of time studying this and still not know 10% of what Fernando knows about the topic. So like all good editors, I delegated. So without further ado tonight, let me introduce my right-hand man and your moderator for tonight, Fernando Diaz.
That was too kind. Thank you. All right, thank you very much for being here. As Audrey said, it's an honor for me to be on this stage with this esteemed panel. To my right, we have Brian Behlendorf, who's the Executive Director of Hyperledger. To his right, we have Renee DiResta, who's Head of Policy at Data for Democracy. And to the far right, we have Asa Raskin, co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology and the Earth Species Project, which we may get into. We have a couple of exercises, and we have a very short PowerPoint that we wanted to share as a baseline, just so that we're all operating with somewhat of a common understanding of certain terms, certain concepts that we hope to get very deep into. This panel has decades of experience working in technology, shaping much of the technology that we use today, and in some ways, with blockchain, shaping some of the technology that we'll all end up using at some point. So what we're hoping also is that each of you can walk away with some sense of empowerment. That you can feel like you can actually forget your phone at the office, and that your world won't come crashing down, that you can turn it off. And with that, Asa, you had shared with us a little experiment that you wanted to conduct on our esteemed guests here.
The power of being on stage. So one of the things I think we hear all the time, the arguments against privacy is like, oh, I have nothing to hide, so it doesn't matter whether like my data is leaked or governments can see it. So this is sort of my argument against that. So I want to take everyone to get out their phone. So take out your phone.
This is safe.
You're allowed to do
I'm probably going to lose you all as you're going to check your email now. But get out your phone, then open up the Photos app. And then when you've opened up the Photos app, just take your phone and put it up and just shine the light at us. Yeah, I can see. That way I can see. Oh, it's so pretty. It's like Freebird.
Yeah.
All right. So now, no, keep it up. Now take your phone and hand it to the person to your right.
Oh, wow.
Wow. So
all right.
this is incredible. This is the first audience where people haven't shouted out, hell no. And it's interesting, right? Because it's like you feel this moment of hesitation, like, no, I don't want to do that. And yet we give this incredibly intimate and detailed portrait of ourselves to companies all the time, and we never think twice about it.
Yeah. So now I'm going to ask everyone here if they will turn off their phones.
Even harder.
And even harder, right? It does give you a sense of anxiety. You don't need to turn your phone off if you feel like you need to share anything on social media or keep it on in case there's an emergency. Please, by all means, do so. We wanted to start with this brief presentation. We're going to discuss through it, and then we'll dive right into the conversation. Is it time to opt out? Some basics here. 54% of U.S. teens say they spend too much time on their cell phones. And for anybody who knows a teenager or has a teenager, I know you think that stat is wrong, but it came from a verifiable place, the Pew Internet Research Project. And I was alarmed to see that because I think a lot of us see teenagers as completely attached to their mobile devices. 57% of parents have said that they have some measure of keeping track of their phones. Just curious, it's a little hard to see, but of all the folks in the audience, if you do have teenagers, can you raise your hand if you have some restrictive measure to track what your child is doing on their phone? I see almost no hands. All right, so you must be part of the 43%. 72% of teens say they check for their notifications as soon as they wake up, and 4 in 10 express some sense of anxiety if they do not, much like Audrey, have their phone on them. Many Facebook users do not understand how Newsfeed works, yet only 1/3 of people have actually tried to learn about it and actually modify the content that shows up in what is, for many people, the homepage of their daily lives. There's a concept here that we will be diving into, and guys, you can jump in at any time here. Algorithmic curation, which is also sort of understood to be behavior modification. And this is how websites are designed, how they surface content, and the very deliberate ways in which that is done to be addictive, to keep you there. Because the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been generated in the Silicon Valley social media technology economy really is predicated on our attention, right? So it's incumbent upon them to each fight as hard as they possibly can to keep us on their platform and not that of their competitor. We're going to talk a little bit, or a lot, Renee has her way, which I hope she does, about bots. We are less than 2 months away from a historic for our lifetimes and probably historic for human society with the midterm elections. Clearly, we're still trying to figure out what exactly happened. Do we know what happened in 2016?
So my name's Renee DiResta. I study computational propaganda, and so my area is actually not privacy, it's malign narratives. It's ways that bad actors manipulate narratives on social media and take advantage of the social ecosystem to do it. So what I look at in I spent a lot of time looking at this in the context of Russia in 2016. And while the reports have sort of yet to be written, there's no doubt that the campaign happened. I think we're still trying to sort out the extent of the impact. And this is sort of independent from the collusion narrative. The fact that they manipulated the election on social media absolutely 100% happened. There's nobody doubts that it happened. I think the question is really, to what extent did it change hearts and minds? To what extent does propaganda influence us? To what extent does pervasive dissemination of a message seen repetitively over and over again across the entire social ecosystem change the way that we think and the way that we relate to each other?
And what are you seeing ahead of November?
It's been interesting, actually much less on the propaganda, much more on automation inserting itself in malevolent ways into real activism. What we believe is likely to happen is that as the platforms have learned from what happened in 2016 and as they've made structural shifts to their algorithms, to their ad transparency modules, which didn't previously actually exist, so we've started to see ways in which this is it's an information war, and as the platforms change the tactics, the state of play changes, which means that the adversaries find new tactics and new ways to interfere. Mm-hmm. So one story that broke on Friday was that at 2 o'clock in the morning, Texas time, a whole lot of people suddenly began tweeting in support of Ted Cruz. And they all tweeted a completely identical message. And so my job is actually to try to understand how these things happen and how that particular campaign was carried out. And what we learned was that Twitter had created this ad type a while back. And the ad type allows privileged accounts, mostly politicians, to create a card. And when you click on the button on the card, it echoes the message. So it lets you tweet the same thing that the tweet you've just read by the candidate says. So in this case, it was hashtag I stand with Ted Cruz. This is related to the anthem. And so when a certain number of real people begin to click that button, they look like bots. That's the sort of funny thing. So they're putting out this message. Everybody's clicking and putting out this message, amplifying this campaign narrative. And then what we saw at 2 a.m. Friday morning was mass quantities of fake people, suddenly blasting this content out. And so you created an environment where real activism, or clicktivism as it came to be called, is actually easily co-optable now, because once that message is out and 100 people have tweeted it, it's not that hard for someone running a botnet to have 500 more tweet it, or 1,000 more, or 100,000 more. And that's how they work to try to coordinate the message to make it look as if consensus and passion around a particular topic has many more people than it really does.
And what time is 2 a.m. in Texas?
It's 10 a.m. in Moscow. It's right after stand-up.
So one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about at Center for Humane Technology is we look at the human as, is this an animal or is it a creature? And we have a set of limitations. So just like, we can only run so fast, our brains also have a set of limitations. And if you had a piece of software that was 10,000 years old and had never received a security update or a software patch, you can better believe there'd be huge vulnerability and exploits. And so one of these vulnerabilities in the human mind is social conformity. So there's this experiment in the 1950s called the Solomon Asch experiment on social conformity. It's a very simple test. They would ask you to come into a lab, and they'd give you 3 lines, A, B, and C, and then a 4th line, and they just say, is this line the same length as A, B, or C? You can measure with your fingers. When they asked you to do it on your own, you'd get it right 100% of the time. Then they'd have 3 actors, before you gave your answer, give the wrong answer. And here's the question. Do you believe your own eyes more? Remember, you can measure with your fingers. Or do you conform? And here's what they found. They found that 5% of people always conformed. 20% of people never conformed, which is great, all the people in this audience. And 70% of people conformed some or most of the time. So that means 75% of people, there are 3 times more people that conform to what they think other people think rather than go with their own lived experience. And that's the vulnerability that these bots are taking advantage of. And it's the first time in history that we have platforms that intermediate what we believe our friends believe, which means they own our sense of reality.
I want to take just a brief moment because you did introduce Center for Humane Technology, and as moderator, I neglected to get through each organization. Brian, can you tell us Hyperledger?
Sure.
What do you do there?
Sure. So we are a part of the Linux Foundation. Sorry. And the Linux Foundation is a industry consortium comprised of lots of companies working together to build internet-enabling technologies, open source technologies, from the Linux operating system to software and cloud computing and software-defined networking, all these kind of interesting spaces. And about 2.5 years ago, it launched the Hyperledger project. I joined shortly after that to try to say that there's this interesting technology underpinning things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And for those who might not be fans of some of the phenomenon that have developed around Bitcoin and Ethereum, that's totally a legitimate point of view. But there are a lot of people who say this underlying technology, we could use it for things other than just cryptocurrencies. We could use it for traceability of all sorts of different systems. Whenever you have a community of organizations or individuals trying to agree on a common ground truth. Because in digital systems where everything can be copied, everything can be modified, everything stored can be modified, getting to a ground truth that we know is immutable, as they call it, that achieves, think of the same thing as when you sign a contract and you hire, somebody to act as a witness to that contract, right? Imagine doing that at scale, and that's really what blockchain technology is about. It's about saying, as a community of whatever arbitrary size, can we work together and come to ground truth in a sequence of transactions, a sequence of back and forth between us that allow us to have high confidence when something's written that it's not removed? By example, if I were to ask you all, what happened on July 20th, 1969, right? How might we go about finding that? Now, pretend you don't have Wikipedia, pretend you don't have Google, but even if we did, how do we know that what's reported on those sites is actually what happened? Well, there's microfiche sitting in libraries around the world of newspapers published on the 21st and the 22nd that would probably tell us, by and large, that the 20th was the day that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, right? So that degree of ground truth comes from all these different points of view agreeing on a common consensus. And then in blockchain technology, we use fancy math to prove that this sequence of events is the same for everybody, and that's what you can build all sorts of interesting things on top of.
I think that's the best description for blockchain I've heard, which is what you need the executive director of Hyperledger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Renee, can you tell us, you are the head of policy at Data for Democracy. Data for Democracy is a nonprofit. Tell us a little bit more about your organization.
Yeah, so after November 2016, my colleague Jonathan Morgan, he and I met working on countering ISIS propaganda back in 2015. We began to have this feeling that there was a unique skill set that data scientists had that could be kind of put to use for social good. There were also a lot of people, of course, after November 2016 who were looking for ways to get active. And so Data for Democracy was born largely to create kind of both community-driven but also government partnerships. Jonathan, I kind of cut that off. Jonathan and I met as volunteers for United States Digital Service. We were asked to come down by the Obama White House to work on this ISIS social network problem. It was a transformative experience for both of us because it gave us a way to come down and serve and use our skills, put them to good. We lived in DC for a month working on this project, even with day jobs. and we wanted to kind of, we were concerned that Jonathan was concerned that would dissipate when the administration rolled. And so Data for Democracy was sort of set up to provide that. And I think we're at 4,000 members now. We've done everything from partnering with the city of Boston on analyzing vehicular fatality data to try to improve traffic patterns, ProPublica, some of the ad transparency work that they're doing around the election, Amnesty International working on some unfortunate trolling situations. So we have both community-driven efforts and then partnership-driven efforts.
And you're an advisor to Center for Humane Technology?
Yes.
And Asa, can you just tell us a little bit more about Center for Humane Technology, and then we'll get through the rest of the
Yeah, sure. So the Center for Humane Technology, we're made out of a whole bunch, people, but we're made out of former tech insiders. So I help build the web at Mozilla. If you've ever scrolled infinitely on your phone, I'm sorry, that was me. It's interesting, right? Because that's a perfect example of when I was thinking about designing that was thinking about how can I make this as easy as possible for one person? Scrolling already means show me more through history. So every time as a designer you ask the user to make a decision or do something they don't care about, you failed, entirely not realizing that when you scale that up to the entire internet, you're going to waste hundreds of millions of human hours. So anyway, the Center for Human Technology were made of like ex-Facebook, ex-Google, and we look at the way in which technology destabilizes the world and how to stop it. Yeah.
Great. So one of the ways that it does that is through programmatic advertising, which is if you've ever searched for a tent that you need on the next vacation, or a pair of shoes, or a new piece of software, and it tracks you and follows you until maybe you're guilted into making that purchase, that is programmatic advertising. Most of the companies online are tracking your behavior. How many of you use privacy extensions on your web browsers? Some of you? Right. So that's an effort, and we'll talk about that, to be proactive about limiting what each of these companies tracks via cookies that they place in your user history.
It's been less than a week since the deadliest mass shooting in
sorry.
American history.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, if we wanted to riff on that a bit,
Yeah.
I mean, if Aza's oopsie was Infinite Scroll, my oopsie was putting the first ad banner online.
Oh, no.
Wired Magazine, 1994.
That's a
I know.
prosecution.
You know, if I hadn't, my excuse, if I hadn't done it, somebody would have done it the week later, which they did. And compounding that with, Wired's website, Hotwired, was one of the first where you had to log in to create a name and password, reset by email. And the goal was never deep tracking. In fact, I remember having a conversation with people at Wired where they were like, so wait, we can see what ads and what articles people read and we could tailor things. And I was like, yeah, but that would be creepy. And people would get that that's creepy and then they'd stop reading you, right? And it didn't occur to me that it would take 20 years for that cycle of realization and behavior modification to kick in. But it was pretty clear early on that combined with the cookie, which certainly the community of people building web software at the time kind of realized like that can be used to track behavior and across websites and things. There were weak attempts to try to say, well, let's set the standards in such a way that tracking across sites or tracking in ways that would be surprising to the end users wouldn't be possible. Mm-hmm. And that extra complication was seen as unnecessary. And likely with agendas behind it that said, well, actually, we do want deep tracking, but it would have required extra effort and effort by the browser makers at the time to actually act in the interest of their end users. And 1994, 95 was still pre-Mozilla, an organization that fights for the interests of users, where the other browser makers, my take, is that they do view you, the reader, as the product rather than the customer. And this is an after effect of that.
Yeah. And would you say, too, that largely these platforms are free because they're dependent on us being the product, right? All of the data that they are collecting on us effectively makes us that.
If it's a commercial organization that's behind that, if it's a nonprofit like Mozilla, Mozilla does also make its money by directing users to the search engines out there and getting feedback from that. And so they also have been accused from time to time of serving the interests of those advertisers. But the code out there and the way that, so you can also speak to this, the culture inside the organization is very much one of writing that balance between making things work for end users, for individuals, but finding ways to make a sustainability model around it too.
Yeah. I've been reminded that we will have time for question and answer, about 20 minutes, so a good fair amount of time. You should have received cards as you walked in to be able to write down your question. So if you do have a question, please write it down, and Audrey and Sarah will be collecting those. I don't see them right now. There they are in the back. So if you have a question, please give it to them and they'll get it back to us. And then before we continue, Renee, do we have anything to blame you for?
I have nothing to confess.
All right.
I was a trader on Wall Street when they were building the internet, so I feel like
you're here to clean it up.
Well, it's amazing because I was a high frequency trader. Actually, I was an algorithmic arbitrager at a firm called Jane Street, and it was amazing being on Wall Street as a trader through the financial crisis, and then seeing the outrage and the reckoning and the legislation and the regulation, and then leaving in 2011 and coming here, and it was this, well, you're doing innovation now, and this is Silicon Valley has such a good soul, and now to kind of be riding it through again.
We are the Wall Street, basically.
There was such incredible optimism, like in early web, where we're democratizing voice and we're decentralizing creativity. At least, sort of while I was growing up in this, the idea that the internet could be open, we could connect people, is just an inherent good.
Yeah.
not realizing all of the terrible unintended consequences that was going to happen. There's often the quip that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And the flip of that is there are only two groups of people that call their customers users. One is tech, and the other are drug dealers.
Nice. This next slide is going to auto-play, so I'll just set it up a little bit here. But part of that, everyone can publish now. The technology has become so much more sophisticated. Fake news is so good in some ways that it does appear real. And machines have been created to create videos that appear real by studying speech patterns and facial practices. So this is a video here of one of those technologies in play emulating former President Barack Obama's speech.
It's been less than a week since the deadliest mass shooting in American history. And foremost in all of our minds has been the loss and the grief felt by the people of Orlando.
Here's the ground truth video of Obama saying the same words.
Especially our friends who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I visited with the families of many of the victims on Thursday, and one thing I told them is that they're not alone.
The heart of our method is a recurrent neural network that transforms input audio to a time-varying mouth shape.
My election symbolizes some progress, at least within the small confines.
Hey everybody, today 20 million more American adults know the financial security of health insurance.
Here we go. President Barack Obama. When you're giving a speech, make sure you use a lot of pauses.
So Renee, I know you wanted to riff a little bit on this, and we talked a little bit about it backstage, where it doesn't need to exist in order to be perceived as real. Just the very idea that it could exist is enough. Can you talk a little bit about sort of this world of fake news?
Yeah, so this is called GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks. There's another product that does it just with voice. Adobe Voco is so there's a number of suites of these products. Adobe Voco is one of the more popular ones. Around the end of last year, you might remember Donald Trump beginning to wonder whether or not he had actually said, "Grab him by the pussy." And what happened after he began to publicly wonder about that, and of course there's audio tape, was you would see these Twitter replies to him. And they would say, there'd be these acolytes, and they would say, "You never said that. It's all a conspiracy. It was made with Adobe Voco. Hillary probably organized it." These are tweets. You can search for when you don't have your phone out. When you're back home, search for Adobe Voco, and you'll see these threads. And what's remarkable about it is Adobe Voco didn't exist. It hadn't been publicly released. Nobody knew about it at the time during the campaign when this whole Pussygate was happening. And so what we saw was the insinuation that the tape could be fake come about many, many, many months after we had all internalized the tape as real, and after Billy Bush had, in fact, to his credit, acknowledged being there and apologized for it. So there is no doubt in anybody's mind that that happened and that recording is legitimate. But if you go now and you search for it and you search for Adobe Voco, you will see hundreds of people on Twitter like speculating now after the fact about whether or not that had all been a vast conspiracy. And so the fact that people know that these types of technologies exist has put us in this sort of uncanny valley where you don't even have to make the fake Obama or the fake Trump. You can point to real video, real upsetting video, and say, "Oh, it wasn't me, it was doctored." And so that it creates the ability to generate distrust, to create the kind of confusion of people not trusting their senses, not trusting their eyes, not trusting what they know. So it's sort of like a mass gaslighting by way of pointing to a technical product and saying, like, no, it wasn't me, it was Adobe Voco.
This is what happens when we're. Oh, sorry, go on.
It's kind of an old problem too, right? You know, back to Neil
Photoshop.
Armstrong landing on the moon, right? Lots of people thought that that was manufactured in a studio somewhere,
Right.
right? So truth is elusive. There's no question about that. But ultimately, I think having witnesses to an act, having systems that can help us attest to the integrity and veracity of documents, of events that happen, and there is that sliver that I think blockchain technology can help with is establishing, timestamps on documents, timestamps on things, like maybe getting to the point where if you're a journalist and you're taking photos of a crime scene or of an atrocity happening in front of you, having those photos go up to a server somewhere, get a timestamp, get written to a record, to a ledger, a blockchain of some sort, would help establish a ground truth that then could not be gone back and changed beyond your control when you actually wanted to use that as evidence in a court or something like that. So that's, I think, one sliver of hope here.
I think one of Silicon Valley's dirty words is democratize. We love to use democratize, but then would you really want to have nuclear weapons democratized? Because that's sort of what we're doing here, right? Yeah, of course we could have, you could have gotten a huge studio. It would have cost millions of dollars to create one of those hoax videos. But now, this technology can do Obama in a research lab. That means in 18 months, everyone will have this app on their phone. I've compiled, I've made videos like this. It's just a little bit of work right now. And so it's not going to be, I think there's often a conception okay, there are going to be a couple people making specific videos, disinformation. No, we're going to be swimming in this stuff in just a couple of years. There'll be bots that just see whatever is the latest trending video on YouTube or Twitter and just immediately start generating hundreds of versions. And the Pussygate thing, if that happened in another year, that audio would come out and then immediately there would be 1,000 versions of that audio clip. And then news organizations would be like, well, who's to know which is true? You have to decide. And the thing that gets me really worried is sort of think about the political campaign of 8 years from now, where we already micro-target ads to you, so we know what your interests are based on what you put into Facebook, how you talk, and now you can start generating, oh, hey, actually, we know from research that if we want to make you trust a face, we just have it be an average of all of your Facebook friends' images. And you have no choice but to trust that person. It's just our hardwiring does that. You make it in a voice that's a little similar to your father's voice, and you just start to trust it. That's the world that we're moving to quickly, and we don't yet, I think, have good solutions for how to think about it. And it's because we're trapped inside of this mind-body suit, and we have these limitations. We as Silicon Valley, I think, need to start moving from just make things that work for people, but start thinking of the human as a system which has frailties that we need to protect.
I think one of the interesting things about this also is the idea of truth. As we start to think about solutions and mitigation mechanisms, detection mechanisms, which is sort of where I focus, we really try to avoid the word truth because we don't want this to be a problem of truth and narrative. Because what that leads to is platform companies saying we don't want to be the arbiters of truth and then framing the problem as a problem of truth. It's not a narrative. It's not a problem of truth and narrative, it's a problem of information integrity. It's a problem of the fundamental inability to identify what is an integrity in content. And that's partially attribution, that's partially, this is where I think the blockchain stuff is actually interesting. One of the things that we saw with the Russia content is none of it would have come down for any kind of objectionable terms of service problems. It was fake people masquerading as Americans pushing out content that if an American had produced would have been left up because it was just a political opinion. It wasn't hate speech, it wasn't violent, it was actually fairly mundane, sometimes actually funny. But the issue was integrity, right? The voice purporting to be the purveyor of that content is an inauthentic voice. So a lot of this stuff comes down on grounds of authenticity of the account. Is it what it purports to be?
Right.
And that leads to a whole other series of challenges. I think with deepfakes, they're called deepfakes because porn, of course, is one of the first areas where this technology was put out into the wild. And on the porn sites, they started taking them down on grounds of non-consent. the actresses famous actresses' faces were sort of superimposed on, in various compromising positions, and they took them down on grounds of non-consent, that the actress had not consented to appear in a pornographic video. But that doesn't translate when it's just speech, and you get into all these, conversations about fair use, and is it satire, and what is it? So I think we really just need to be getting to a conceptualization of information integrity and making the platforms more responsible for that.
Yeah. And I think one of the key themes that we'll be discussing through the rest of this conversation is consent, which is a perfect segue into sort of privacy. And how many of you know who this individual is? This is James D'Angelo, who's the suspected Golden State Killer, who was apprehended earlier this year based on a DNA connection. One of his distant relatives had used a DNA service, and the authorities had been collecting DNA by sifting through his garbage, and ultimately were able to make a connection with Mr. D'Angelo, unbeknownst to his distant relative who had been using a DNA service purportedly to research their genealogy. And so, consent is a perfect segue into sort of the rest of the conversation. And this is the last slide, which is basically, can we have any reasonable expectation of privacy? Are we actually exerting our own free will when we use these platforms? Does anybody read terms of service and really understand what they're giving up or what they're agreeing to when we use these relatively innocuous platforms to connect ourselves, as you said, Asa, in the original spirit of the internet, by connecting ourselves to each other? How much consent do we actually have?
Oh man, it's hard. Or there's just some other interesting things to show like how hard this kind of consent is, to know like how much data you just as a human being living are throwing off. So if you just take 4 points of where you've been, which your phone is sending to Google or Apple, it just takes 4 points to uniquely identify, I think, 95% of the US population. We can tell now, like it's sort of the end of the poker face, we can tell how much you're thinking, your cognitive load, by just tracking your eye dilation, or your pupil dilation rather. From a webcam, we can get clinical level heart rate. So we know like when you're starting to get agitated and when you're not. When you're walking, your gait, turns out that's as identifying as a fingerprint. So you don't even need to see your face, you can just watch your feet. In China now, they use facial recognition, so when you're crossing the street in certain cities and you jaywalk, they do facial recognition, they know who you are, and they put up onto large LCD screens instantly your name and your face. Strangely, people there are actually sort of into it.
I'm going to jaywalk just for that reason.
Yeah, exactly, like, whoo, like the kiss cam. And so the idea of consent is really, really hard, because even though you may be consenting for a primary use, I'm using this thing for whatever reason, we're constantly leaking information. And even the frame around we need to be able to own our data, I think is a little like outdated, because Facebook right now could take every piece of information they had about you, throw it away, and it wouldn't really change their business model, because they've already built an algorithm and a model that does all of the work of predicting what kinds of things you're going to buy or click or do. So an example of this is recently Facebook had to come out and say, hey, we don't actually listen to like your conversations via the microphone on your phone. When you've had a conversation with a friend about a specific brand of, say, shoes, and the next morning you wake up and that brand of shoes that you've never talked about online is now at the top of your feed, that's not because we're listening, it's just because we know you, right? That one's actually way creepier to me. And the point is, like, that comes from a model, not comes from data. And so the way we're even thinking about it now that we have these supercomputers and algorithms is sort of broken.
No, I think we have to do it and we can do it. And it being change that relationship between end users and consumers, the public, and the companies in the technology industry who are providing products and services to them, but have operated for the last 25 years on the presumption that any data they've collected from you, because they've sent you a 300-page terms of service, they now have the right to do whatever they want with. And that compact, I mean, I can't think of any engineer in Silicon Valley who hasn't had an awkward conversation with a product manager or an executive going, yeah, but that would be creepy. Why would we do that? You know, and the psychopathic kind of answer is because it would increase margins, increase revenue. We have to change that, and it might be by regulation, such as the GDPR in Europe, which kind of said, I don't care what kind of terms of service you cram down the end user's throat, you have to give them the right to know what you've collected about them and give them agency. An agency with that data, meaning they should know who you've shared it with and be able to withdraw consent, withdraw their sharing of that data with you, and all sorts of other things that there are still a lot of questions about how it'll actually get interpreted and enforced. Had this law been introduced 10 years ago, it would have been actually pretty hard to say, well, what's a technology infrastructure that could actually be used to help consumers understand what's the data that they have shared, who have they shared it with, under what terms, and how do they claw that consent back? Because remember, reality is defined by the other side of that connection, by the Facebook, by the Googles, et cetera. So one of the things that people in the internet and identity community who have long fretted about this issue and been frustrated at the fact that they couldn't have been able to solve this through OpenID and OAuth and other protocols, which is how we all try to implement things, has been the emergence of this different way of thinking about identity sometimes it's called self-sovereign identity, sometimes it's called user-centric or self-managed identity. But the idea is that you have something that to the end user looks a little more like a wallet, right? Less like a television, or even what the web browser has kind of become a kind of passive television experience, and more like something that you actively guard and manage and has things about you that are really important. Things like your passport, your driver's license, things that you create, such as here's my home shipping address. And I'm happy to share these documents and present them to people when they want to know, am I actually a US citizen? Do I have the right to travel to this country, whatever? Or I'm applying for a job, here's my diploma. But I should be able to keep track of who I've shared that with. And if I go on vacation and I get hurt and I see a doctor and they want to see my prescription history, I should be able to share that from my wallet. Remember that I shared it with that doctor, and when I'm back home, withdraw consent to that information, because they don't need to know my prescription history, least of all going forward from that point, right? And so this different model, there's a number of companies and nonprofits. We've got a project at Hyperledger focused on this as well. The missing piece, the reason it wouldn't have worked 10 years ago, that it will work now, or we hope that it'll get closer, is tracking this consent and how it's been revoked involves recording these things in a place that is neutral, right? That's neither owned by or exclusively defined by the server, neither owned or exclusively defined by the end user, but is mutual. And these technologies, distributed ledgers, et cetera, give us an opportunity to do that. Not perfect, but I still am idealistic. I go, 25 years ago, we were idealistic about the web connecting people. I still have that idealism, but we just need to continue to be smart and course correct as we find them used against us.
Is there any reasonable expectation that the companies that have become among the most valuable in the history of man would adopt such a technology if it would restrict their ability to further monetize us as products?
This is the thing keeping medical records from being able to be owned by end users and shareable. 90%, I saw this stat this morning, 90% of patients report having given false or incomplete data to their providers out of a fear that that data would work its way to the insurance company or to somebody else they had no control over, right? So the healthcare industry now gets bad data, right? And your doctor gets bad data when they're trying to treat you around a condition, right? Multiply that by financial records, right? If a financial advisor or an algorithm even can't have access to the right data, they're not going to create the right recommendations for you. Multiply it by every kind of situation out there where you have meaningful information data about you that you want to try to track. And I think we hit upper limits in our ability to solve real problems unless we solve this. And companies are realizing this. They suffer real pain from this as well.
Yeah. Renee, earlier this summer, California passed a first bill somewhat similar to GDPR, an attempt through the Privacy Act to institute some rights, some recourse for consumers to be able to have some say in this country. Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction, that whether it's the companies that Center for Humane Technology is working very actively with, or state legislatures themselves, and maybe even the federal government, are going to be much more proactive about trying to institute some of these protocols.
I think they have been. I think the fact that people are having conversations about it, the fact that it's sort of risen to the position of public awareness is remarkable, honestly. I'm sort of, I don't know if you feel the same way. I'm sort of like, wow, people are talking about terms of service. What a novelty.
And I will say, so one of the projects that Center for Humane Technology has is a movement called Time Well Spent, which is saying, these companies are stealing all of our time. When you look back at the end of a week, do you want to have your time filled, or do you want to have your time be fulfilling? We've been working on that. In fact, one of our founders, Tristan Harris, he's been working this for over 5 years, and it was only this year that Apple and Google, and now even Instagram and Facebook have started working on time well spent digital wellness features. You may have seen a whole bunch of the launches in the last round, where they give you dashboards and controls for how much time you spend using apps. And the only reason why these companies are now doing that is because people care, that it became a movement and there was enough demand for it. Although it's sort of funny, because these companies are taking the role of gaslighting, or a little bit of an abusive relationship, whereas because they're like, all right, we're gonna put 1,000 engineers behind every screen. We're going to use as much machine learning and A/B testing as we can to make sure that you're addicted and glued to this thing. But here's a little tool that'll help. And also, it's your fault if you use it too much, right?
Yeah. And so, but you're saying this is actually.
But anyway, this is a good thing, right? Not that part. Yeah. But it's the fact that they are, for the very first time, starting to take responsibility for the role that platforms and technology has in our lives, and not just saying it is just your fault, but actually it's our fault too. I think that's an incredibly positive step, and we should definitely give them carrots so they keep doing more.
I think we are at the same place where unsafe at any speed was with the automotive industry in the 1970s, I guess, yep. Where the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire led to what was that book? Sorry, I'm just reaching here. Is that talked about workplace conditions. It was in the Industrial Revolution. Basically, these moments where in a given industry they realize there is this obligation to the broader public that needs to be served, and where the end user community, the public community, does have finally the self-awareness and the tools to say we're going to demand something different and better. And that might express itself as regulation. It might express itself as using a different web browser, if we can make it as targeted as that. But this is a moment around those types of things, those end user safety kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. I think in part one of the ways I think about it, maybe because everything looks like a nail, but after the 2016 election, I remember thinking okay, now we're going to start talking about the algorithms. Now we're going to start talking about the recommendation engine. Now we're going to start talking about polarization. Now this is going to become a thing. And it's going to become a thing because of what just happened in this election in this country, and the fact that people watched it happen. The fact that people watched the Twitter bot armies. The fact that people watched the voices that are quite small in number but do a remarkable job amplifying themselves because of structural flaws in the system. The silver lining to, maybe some of you were happy with it, I wasn't, but the silver lining to all of this is going to be that it's going to kick off that conversation. And then when the Russia investigation started, it was actually it was the playbook of what so many other groups have done for such a long time, but it was being done to disrupt an election, as opposed to done to disrupt small policies, done to disrupt conversations, done to disrupt groups. We started seeing mass targeted harassment be framed, or with botnets that were kind of doing those types of activities. When they did it to regular people online, nobody talked about it, but when it was done to journalists during the campaign, or when it was done to celebrities, then it became much more of a story. So it was really this sort of precipitating crisis that I think led to the unpacking of the ways in which mass consolidation of people onto a handful of platforms, easily gameable algorithms, and precision targeting had sort of like become this sort of like unholy trifecta of confluence factors that had facilitated basically this mass manipulation engine. And now we were going to begin to have the conversation. The reporters were going to begin to write about it, and we have conversations like this.
Right.
It's like one of these like very, very, very slow, and then it just kind of like goes off a cliff. And I imagine you felt like that with Time Well Spent. That was sort of my experience on the disinformation stuff too.
But even as we're having this conversation and as it's becoming a conversation, and we're months away from the midterms, but we're also, I think, I'm going to quote you, at 8 years from everybody having a deepfakes app on their phone.
Oh, I think it's 18 months.
18 months.
Yeah.
I'd say like 5 years.
5 years, Brian?
I'm not going to predict.
Okay. So, but it's also going to get even harder, right? So I think as Audrey and Sarah and I were sort of trying to figure out how to frame sort of this conversation, we were like deliberately trying to figure out, could we get to a place where someone could effectively opt out? You know, it's too much. There's too much information. You don't actually need to be on Facebook 15 times a day. You don't need Twitter. You don't need YouTube. If you want a human connection, you can pick up the actual phone part of your phone and call somebody, or you can go have coffee and meet them in real life.
I don't think it's about a neo-Ludditism, like shut off all the communication channels, because these things are only becoming more deeply embedded and embodied in who we are, and I will get closer yet. But all of us are, I think, of a certain age where like we probably, our first internet social network was an email list, right? And I think one of the things that those platforms did that was very different was detach the communications and conversation platform from the concept of a host, right? Like, has anyone ever gone to a party but like the host of the party isn't there, that they aren't at the front door letting you in, where it's just a room? And you might know some people there, you might not. No, I mean, everybody, you go to a party, you go to a convening, and there's a host to it. There's a moderator, there's somebody helping it make sense and make it a productive use of everyone's time. Nor are these spaces, though, at the other extreme, public squares. I think we make a mistake when we frame them as, well, you wouldn't, shut somebody down for their free speech rights, standing in Union Square, talking about, whatever they want to talk about. This is something different. These are convened settings, and we do need to talk about where is the public square on the internet. I think it's frankly more at the level of the domain name system and your ability to host a blog on whatever you want, right, on your own dime, on your own infrastructure, but you don't necessarily have an embodied right, entitled right to be in everyone else's living room, right? But just if we had more of these convened spaces and more of a culture of understanding not only how to participate in these convened spaces, but host them as well, and the responsibility of a host to deal with that rambunctious like party attendee who's throwing the vases all around and hitting people in their heads, whatever, like that matters, and I think that's what we need to find a way to recapture.
Well, and I'm curious too. I think many people would consider Mark Zuckerberg to be hosting the craziest rave ever with the cops are not coming, right? Except now Zuckerberg
good
is
raves have good DJs,
there you
good
go.
party hosts.
Well, Zuckerberg, Sandberg, Dorsey, not Google, have testified recently before Congress about their businesses. We were talking about, sort of the questions that they levied specifically at Mr. Zuckerberg.
He'll say things like the community, like we're about building the Facebook community. There's no Facebook community, right? There's no place where you as Facebook users have agency in influencing the direction of the platform, except by your clicks and your addictions, right? Let alone a conversation about how to implement things that you need, or how to be peers with the people who are building the technology behind it. That's not built in.
But there would seem to be at least the illusion of community,
and that's the veil we
specifically
could pierce.
because all of our friends and family are there.
I think that's the veil we could pierce, and maybe, and I'm sorry to dominate,
No.
but I feel like there's a media literacy that we develop whenever new forms of media emerge in humanity, that we must have learned with the radio, that we certainly started to see with television, how to moderate, how much television you watch and what to believe, that we saw with email. I mean, again, being of a certain age, I remember falling into rabbit holes around email and IRC, being up all night, forgetting to go to class, at Berkeley or whatever, like
AOL.
And then you kind of learn how to manage the addiction, the addictive quality of these different platforms, and get the most out of them, and filter out the noise. Frankly, my Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds are not as horror show as a lot of other people talk about theirs, because I've frequently unfollowed and unsubscribed people. So I don't think it's opt out. I don't think it's opt into everything, but it's let's learn skills no matter what age we're at, no matter what bracket we're at, and how to manage the information diet that we all consume, right? And think of it as very much worth managing for the same reason you manage the food that you eat, and your exercise regimen and other kinds of things you do to care for yourself.
Asa, could you talk a little bit about how or if the platforms at this stage in the conversation are helping folks do what Brian suggested, which is curate, trim, follow, unfollow, surface in a much more understandable way how to limit what you're contributing or what you might share or who could see that or what they can do with that data?
Yeah, so the way that these decisions get made internally at the companies is like they have these dashboards. This is how much time people are spending, how frequently they come back, and there'll be these long conversations about like what can we show people that well, one that'll keep them around, but also that might be good for them. But they will never ask the question like, would it be better for them to be off screen right now? And because of that, they'll always bias back in towards getting people to stick around. And if it's sticking around, guess what? Then they're going to bias towards content which gets your amygdala to fire up. So this is why we end up with news feeds that tends towards polarization, because though humans can't help but stare at car crashes as you go by them. Their AI sees that, and it's like, aha, this person, you all love car crashes. I'm going to show you more car crashes. So far from the platforms I've seen more, they've seen this as a PR problem, and so they're applying PR solutions, but there's nothing really systemic, I think, that they're changing to make it better, because it's not in their business interest. And it's just that simple.
Mm-hmm. Renee, did you want to add to that?
I think about it as dual-use technology. So I am a non-opt-outer. I think we were having the pre-call, and they're like, and then Renee's going to say why we should all stay on. But I think it's the Facebook groups, I think, are the example that pops to the top of my mind, right? Like, I'm in Facebook groups. I'm in a lot of Facebook groups. I really like Facebook groups. I use them more than I use... I find them in many ways more interesting than I do find the friends and family stuff. Maybe that sounds awful, but I feel like you find interesting people and have interesting discussions, and I like that about it. On the flip side, in the course of the research I do, one of the things I look at is understanding radicalization pathways. And I look to understand how someone who is an anti-vaccine conspiracist finds their way into QAnon groups. And the answer is that the Facebook recommendation engine recognizes that there's a substantial degree of overlap in the type of people who are members of one group and who are members of another group. This is how Amazon's recommendation engine works. It's called collaborative filtering. It says a large number of people who are similar to you like this thing, ergo we're going to show it to you. So even if I, as an anti-vaxxer who believes this one particular conspiracy theory, have never typed QAnon into the search bar, the algorithm understands that I have this particular belief, and so it begins to serve me things that it sees as tangentially relevant. And these are the sorts of things where, as outsiders, as outside researchers, we can see the suggestions being made, we can see the numbers in the groups growing. What we can't see is if people are proactively searching for that thing. And so this is where, when I talk about dual use, I personally really like Facebook groups. I feel like I'm the critic who sits up here and is like, yeah, I use this stuff all the time. But on the flip side, there are some very unfortunate externalities that come out of the frameworks that we've built, and algorithms that are simultaneously incredibly astute and also very dumb. In the sense that they don't understand what they're recommending, they don't understand whether they should be recommending something, and this is how we have the same radicalization pathways where we see terrorists and anti-government extremists and people who believe one conspiracy theory finding their way into these now kind of omni-conspiratorial groups like QAnon. And that's how this technology that has some very positive, beneficial, I can find a lot of people who I really like to talk to, becomes, and they all believe that Hillary Clinton is murdering children in the basement of a pizza place.
Right.
And this, I think, is sort of a meta point, is when we just sort of sick algorithms or AI at trying to figure out like what's right, then we constantly trade what's right for what works, and so we're like slowly moving our way bit by bit towards amorality, because the machines can't ask, like, is this the right thing? So an example of this would be Facebook discovered at some point that teens in Australia that are depressed buy more makeup, and their algorithms are just shoving makeup at depressed teens. Right? Do we want that to happen? Probably not. Like, this is taking advantage of the most vulnerable in us. Back to your point on dual-use technologies, one of my favorite examples of this is just the car, right? The car lets us both go places we could never go before, do things we could never do before, have mobility, and at the same time, it terraforms our cities so that we live far apart and are isolated, breaks apart communities, and pollutes the environment. Both of these things are true at the same time.
And sometimes kill people.
And also kill people, right. And so the question then is like, technology is not good, it's not bad, but it's also not neutral. And we need to do careful work to understand like which way we're tilting like society, because now that our technology is at scale, like the things we make can reach 100 million people or 2 billion people in less than a year. Like every piece of code we write that's social is inherently political, but we haven't yet caught up to that realization. We're still just sort of like typing away and hoping. I think the thing that we get wrong most is we actually have now with behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, like large-scale A/B tests, we have a pretty good model of how human beings work, but we don't use it when we make our platforms. So we use an optimistic model of like, this is how we wish people worked, this is what makes it easy to do our design, and then we bake those assumptions into our platform. But then people don't work that way. They work over like this, and it's in that gap that we get tragedy, and that we get the things like the destabilization of our democracy.
Yeah, we don't quite have a evolved, defined ethical framework the way that they do in, say, the medical profession with the Hippocratic Oath, right? And do no harm and that sort of thing. And I'm not so certain that it's just transporting that over. But one thing that's important is tool makers need to consider it in the design of their tools, but they need to monitor for it as well. Mm-hmm. They need to be looking at, did we inadvertently re-add redlining, for example, where people who lived in poor neighborhoods couldn't get mortgages, couldn't improve their ways of living. So in the 1980s, I guess the mortgage industry banned the practice of excluding applicants for mortgages based on, purely on the neighborhood they live in. But that was that was something that required action from Congress, right? I think we do need some sort of framework that allows product teams to be able to go to the business side of the house and say, yes, we could do this. It would increase margin by 2%, but it would be evil, and have something to back that beyond just a private conversation. Well, now you think less of me, into something that would generate a public response, perhaps even a regulatory response. Yeah.
Can the right thing be profitable, or more profitable than what you just described?
I don't have any doubt about that. It's hard to compete against others, though, for whom unethical behavior drives them to a more profitable solution. That's where coordinated action, I think, is necessary amongst participants in a market.
Mm-hmm. Look through history to try to find examples of where there are these sort of game theoretic moments where it looks like there's no choice. If you stop doing the bad thing, then your competitors are continue to do the bad thing, and they're going to just surge ahead. So an example of this was slavery, where and I'm not comparing slavery to tech or anything like that, but
although there are some parallels.
Yeah, that's true. Where Britain was like, how can we get off slavery? If we do, that hurts our economy, and so France is going to surge way ahead. And so this is the game theory. No one could get off because other people were going to win, and yet somehow we did. But the UK had to take a hit of 2% of their GDP for 60 years, because sometimes doing the right thing, it will cost money. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
One of the, I want to thank everybody who has submitted a question, and we've still got plenty of time before we actually get into that section, but someone submitted a question that I definitely wanted to tackle in the front part of it. So if you do have questions, please make sure that you find Audrey or Sarah and send them up. We'll be sifting through. This question is, what should we do to protect the next generation? On the first call that we had, we talked about our kids and about how frightening this all is with a 2-year-old or a 3-month-old or a 6-year-old, how intuitively they understand how to use a tablet or a phone. And if we are, as adults, basically, captive animals, then these young people who have Alexa read them bedtime stories are even more vulnerable. So I'd love to hear sort of each of your perspectives on, specifically, as this individual had asked, how do we protect children?
Start with the guys that have children.
All right. Well, I have a 3-year-old, and so this is a skin in the game kind of question for me, right? Because she, has played games on her mom's phone and listens to music and gets that this is a portal to another world. But she's certainly not getting her own phone anytime soon. And we actually have moved to no screen time, like no television and that sort of thing at the home, at least for now. But I do feel at a certain point, I want those media literacy skills that we talked about and that ability to manage that fire hose and understand how to work with it to happen sooner rather than later. Because I think that becomes an essential survival skill in a real digital economy. And I feel like I went through that process in freshman, sophomore year of college, paid a price, but came out the other end of it much better, right? There's a time I worry if I did get on the internet in high school, I might never have graduated. But if I had hit that at some other point, and I had enough mentorship or enough other touch points where it was like, okay, here's how to manage that addiction, manage that information diet. It might have made me an even better student. It might have helped me sail through college, that sort of thing. And it might have been a luxury in 91 or abstract in 1991 when I started college, but it definitely is not going to be abstract in 2018 or when she's in school. So we just have to figure that out and have that be a part of, I think, the grade school years is figuring out how to manage that as you're learning your social, how to manage social relationships with other kids and in society.
Renee?
I've got 2 kids, 4.5 and almost 2. I am tired a lot. I obviously work full-time. I travel a ton. My husband is a software engineer at Dropbox. He's home with the kids now, to his credit. We were joking around backstage about showers. Have you ever taken your phone in the shower? And I was like, I'm going to admit that I have. Yes, I have once taken my phone in the shower, and that was because I just wanted to get away from the kids for like 5 extra minutes, and somebody texted me, and I didn't want to go back to my life, and I was like, okay. But I think that there's it's reality. It's, I don't actually have a TV. That's the funny thing. I don't have a TV. So I feel like, so for me, I will periodically give my son my phone, and what I try to do is I try to make it active. So I try to say, like, instead of watching YouTube, which is a disaster every time, here's a Spanish game, or here's a numbers game, or here's a reading game. I grew up, my first computer booted off a cassette tape, and I think I was like 8. My dad's an engineer, so I used to go to computer shows with him. I went to school for computer science, and I feel like that was like just an absolutely wonderful way to grow up. I remember when the internet arrived, I was in middle school, I think. And I want my children to know how to code. I want them to understand how to engage with technology. It's absolutely like critically important to me. In fact, I was Googling the other day, like, when do you start teaching your kids to code? But I think that it's more a matter of like, how do I teach them to have an active relationship where they also understand what is happening, what they're seeing, why they're seeing it. So even beyond media literacy, like the actual ability to create, the ability to fundamentally deeply understand what they see, why they see it, how to build it, and then how to incorporate it into their own lives.
Asa, you do not have children?
I do not have children.
Then I'm going to pivot this question for you a little
right.
bit, which is to say, you had mentioned that, we have 10,000-year-old brains with no security upgrades, right? How will this technology, I was doing some research today, and Amazon has announced 8 new Alexa-powered devices before the end of the year, one of which is a microwave, which seems so ridiculous because you still have to put the food in the microwave to then actually tell it to eat for 3 minutes, right?
I'm sure Amazon will deliver the food there
That's right.
for you if you let them have it in the front door.
So my question for you is, we're 18 months away from the Deepfakes app that Renee's 6-year-old may or may not be programming. how can we possibly protect children, and ultimately, what society will they be creating for us? Because ultimately, like, we're old, we're done. They're going to shape what we really encounter, right? And sort of that next iteration of culture, of communication, of content, of truth, you know, if there is such a thing. So can you tell us a little about your perspective on that?
Sure. Small. I mean, getting back just a second, it'll sort of build up from like this, the media literacy. So I'm curious, how many of you guys saw the movie The Atomic Cafe when it came out in 1982? Number. Like, it's fascinating because it was a documentary about the atomic warfare made without a narrative or narration, just with propaganda clips. So it's propaganda. Super cool. And the thing that struck me as I was watching it, I went to the remastered version of it a week ago, is that like, oh, it was so obvious to know what propaganda was. People just like, they did this when they were talking. And now I don't know. Like, it's really hard. Like, I don't know how you'd make that film now. It's really hard to know what propaganda is. There's actually something you told me, Renee, that sort of dropped the floor out from underneath me when you were like, you know, Russian bots push anti-GMO and anti-fracking. And I was like, what? Like, I think that like my knowledge of like what's true and out there like is pretty good. I'm pretty savvy. I had no idea. So I'm like, why do I believe what I believe? Like, where did I get, like, why? And so now we're gonna like zoom way out and think about like cosmological sociology because it sounds cool. But what can we say about any species that's sufficiently intelligent? Eventually, it turns its intelligence back on itself and starts to figure out like how it works psycho-emotionally, reverse engineer itself, and so it can like start opening up its brain and metaphorical skull and like start tinkering with things and hacking itself. And it's interesting that we're starting to get there with CRISPR, and we're starting to get there with our information technologies too. You know, governments and corporations have long wanted to hack us so they can like control our behavior and our desires to get us to buy or do what they want. They've just been pretty bad at it. And Harari Yuval had this incredible point, which is we've always known ourselves better than other people, and now with these new technologies, these companies are starting to be able to predict our actions as good or better than us. It turns out with just 300 of your likes on Facebook, an algorithm can look at it. This is the stuff that Cambridge Analytica's work was eventually based on. They could predict your personality and your behavior better than you yourself could. And that's scary because media literacy at that point just isn't enough. And so I think we have to start thinking about things like what are defensive AIs? Like, how do you start arming people so it's not just like your brain versus the world, but like you and your cohort, or something that's trained to like protect you from a fundamentally adversarial world. I don't know what that answer is yet. Sort of know like the parameters for it, and I am sure it's going to be the next generation that starts to really figure it out. So it's about teaching them media literacy as best we can, but then arming them with the tools to make.
Well, and I think that's a perfect transition into the next question, which is, I think probably from an educator, any tips on getting teens to share the urgency to stop the negative impact of tech? There's bullying is Melania Trump's cause, you know, cyberbullying specifically. So how would you say, and Asa, you don't have to have kids, how should we engage not the kids, but the teenagers, the folks who are now just starting to develop that sense of the world and their own role in the world? Are there any tips that you can share with those here about how we might do that?
Yeah. We actually just got an email from a team who said that it was so important for them to see that people were pushing back against tech because they've been trying to convince all of their friends that there are all these terrible things that are going on, that like Snapchat streaks are replacing their own understanding of how good their relationship with their friends are, and that this was it's harmful. And I think just the act of talking about it makes a big difference. It's sort of like the punchline to the like corporations knowing you better than you know yourself is this is like the best opportunity to do self-work and get to know yourself better because that makes you more sovereign in your decision making. And finally, it's like I think it's setting a good role model. It's more than half of U.S. teens say that they don't get enough face time with their parents because their parents are too addicted to their phone. So we have to model too.
Renee?
I was actually just, I don't have a good answer for teens, but I was thinking about something. My son takes this dance class, and I think a lot about like attention. He and my daughter both know what a selfie is, which always feels a little bit weird to me because I'm like one generation past selfie culture. Like it feels narcissistic for me to do that, but like they think nothing of it. And I do think about what does that do, like how is that going to be different for them developmentally versus me. But the reason I was thinking about the dance class is because my son will actually come to the window and like point at my phone if I am looking down at my phone and not. But the problem is I'm like, oh my God, I have to watch this like nonstop for 60 minutes. Like, they're just going back and forth from one side to the other. But he expects my undivided attention. It makes me feel bad for just kind of like sneaking a peek. Anyway, sorry. Continue.
So you should listen to Asa and put the phone down.
How many other moms have been in that situation?
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
The thing I'd add is, there's somebody who should be on this stage talking about this, who's Dana Boyd, who runs a research outfit called Data and Society, who have published a lot of quantitative results focusing on teens' use of social media. And paraphrasing her research is really a challenge, but the takeaway I got from reading some of her papers is the kids are all right, that they actually are very sophisticated in their use of these tools, that sometimes that is to really horrid effects such as revenge porn or cyberbullying, of course. But there's I might take one of those two, or something negative like that if it also got us crisis text hotline. And crisis text hotline, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a text number that anybody, frankly, who feels suicidal, but often gets used by teens for obvious reasons, can text to and say, I need help, I need a friend, I need somebody to talk to, I'm feeling this way. And the first wave of responses to those texts are handled by AI to try to categorize, to try to understand based on previous conversations what kind of support person should be engaged in texting back. And texting is, it doesn't have the immediacy of being on a phone call, but when you're in a bad place, you don't necessarily want to occupy a lot of somebody's time, you don't want to have the burden of of somebody's attention, right? So in a way, it's using that medium, as imperfect as it is, to solve a problem in a way that couldn't have been, or address a problem that couldn't have been addressed before. And so I think frankly it's neutral to positive teens' use of social media, and we'll just have to learn parenting techniques like just reminding them that you love them, reminding them that they can talk with you about anything. If they need to text you something they can't tell you face to face, that's okay too. Like I don't know, this is all theoretical for me and still about 10 years off, but
you're thinking about it now.
But I'm thinking about it now, yeah.
So folks are listening, which is fantastic. Here's a question. I'm glad someone brought up the anti-GMO, anti-fracking by bots.
That's fast.
Can someone talk more about the fact that propaganda bots also pushed left-wing conspiracy theories?
Oh, I can talk about that all day.
We have 16 minutes left. I've heard the bots are pushing division, not just one side. Renee, I think this is for you.
Yeah, so 538 made a percentage of the Russia tweets public. So anyone who does want to go get the data set, they're available in CSV format. So even if you just have Excel, you can pull them down and look at them. They did a really nice job with that. So I should say there were two facets to what happened with the Internet Research Agency campaign. The first, I would say, is creating divisive content. And the way they did that was actually on Facebook by building groups and by creating pages where they worked to develop community and they worked to develop in-group and out-group identity. And so the memes were designed to be resonant. So you would like nod your head like, I too think this. And then every 10th meme would be something that was a little more on the dicey side, like, and also we hate those people, and also you shouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And they did it was a very sustained, long-term, developed relationship over a period of multiple years that they established relationships with these audiences and built these audiences. Then there was the thing that was happening on Twitter. And on Twitter, they were responding very much to what the conversation was on Twitter. It's just a function of the different uses that people have for the platform. And so on Twitter, when the California measles outbreak happened, when the Disneyland measles outbreak happened, all of a sudden the bots started tweeting about vaccines. Now, unfortunately, this has been misreported, in my opinion, as like Putin wants to make Americans not vaccinate their kids. No, what it was here's an opportunistic incidence in which we can create controversy or participate in controversy to grow followers for ourselves, to spread a message. And we have seen this time and time again. We see this with topics that are just kind of considered hot button topics that get people riled up, but we also see it in areas that they consider of strategic interest. So the GMO and fracking stuff was actually not just to kind of like, talk to the lefties. It was much more to create a perception that that Putin had the right answer about GMOs. So it was presented really U.S. agricultural policy in contrast to civilized agricultural policy, and they framed it through sort of the natural, everything is so natural over here, everything is so organic over here. So it was really presented very much in a contrast. They did develop narratives both for the right and for the left. It was absolutely not in any way targeting only one audience. Actually, much of it focused on racism, and there were a substantial amount of effort was devoted to growing not just Black Lives Matter, but also kind of Black separatist pages as well. So there's some stuff that I think will eventually kind of get more attention as people delve more into the data set, but it was really very much targeting both sides.
I want to jump over here into a question we dealt with a little bit in terms of the role of regulators and the abuse. So we talked about GDPR, we talked about the Privacy Act. Congress is hauling these folks in to answer their questions. What role do regulators have, if any, in trying to control bots or trying to control how these systems work? Is there a viable or legitimate role for regulation to play?
Yes. I testified in front of Congress on August 1st, and then I had to send my own policy recommendations, so I'll just kind of cheat and use what I said, which was basically, I don't think that Congress wants to be or should be put in a position of trying to regulate feature-level platform technology. And so while I believe that we should do more to label bots, to manage bots, to deal with bots, I don't think that that's necessarily a regulator's best use of time because the technology changes so rapidly. I think that there are core structural problems, the sort of three things that I was mentioning with regard to gameable algorithms, that I think is best served by platforms, by self-regulation, by press, by industry, by something we didn't really talk much about, which is the role of the kind of rank-and-file engineer to advocate internally. They have profound amounts of power to affect change internally. But the other things, I think some of the narratives right now are around, we have this problem in part because we have mass consolidation onto a handful of platforms. Is antitrust a viable option? What does that look like? It's not traditionally applied in areas where the product is being given away for free. So we don't really have a framework for thinking about what is sometimes, there was a great article about Lena Khan in the New York Times recently, but they called it like hipster antitrust, I think. The idea of like what does modern antitrust look like? And then the second area is the precision targeting, and that's where I think the GDPR, the privacy, the things that make it just a little bit more difficult for targeting to come into play by creating better user protections, better sense of privacy, what's gathered, what sticks. I think those are the areas that regulators should be looking at. And then the straight up national security stuff. There's really not much of there's no deterrence. There's no reason not to do this. There's absolutely nothing to prevent any nation state in the world from deciding to interfere in an American election because there's no consequences. And that I see as a failure of U.S. on security policy.
I think one of the largest surface areas of attack against democracies, and also like the sovereignty and sanctity of our minds, is autocomplete or recommendations. So it turns out that 70% of video views on YouTube come from the recommended, the thing that just plays next automatically. And the problem is that it's been called the great radicalizer of our time by Zenip in the New York Times. Because if you drop, just say, a random teenager, or you just airdrop them onto any video on YouTube, within 2 or 3 video plays, you're off in deep conspiracy theory land. So you drop somebody onto like Trump or Hillary, you end up at sort of like Pizzagate. If you drop them on like eating healthy, you end up going like veganism and then often to like weird things about bees. Just no matter where you start, like you are not extreme enough for YouTube, and it's going to show you more and more extreme things. Right? Something about physics, you end up on flat Earth conspiracy. Just try it. Go home and try it.
Call it 3 degrees of Alex Jones.
And so we had this thing called Rule 230 from the 1996 Communications Act, which said it's the thing that's let software eat the world, and decentralization, or not decentralization, whatever that thing is called, eat the world, is it said you as a platform are not legally liable for content that users post.
This is DMCA?
That was, related. And that let anyone just post to the platforms, and they could grow. The problem is now, there's a freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that there should be a freedom of reach. That the platforms are also not liable for making recommendations, for amplifying content from just one person seeing it to showing it to literally hundreds of millions of people. And so I think one change we can make is to roll back Rule 230 just a little bit and say, hey, if you take content and you amplify it to more than 100 people, 1,000 people, then you as a platform are responsible for that content because you're making a curatorial choice, just like any newspaper or other news media is. And I think that would immediately have a large impact on the kinds of attacks that our democracy is experiencing.
Well, it's reassociating content with the convener, right?
Oh, totally.
Because we don't want to get to the point where like your ISP is now liable for all the traffic flowing across it. And one of the risks of going too far in the other direction in Europe, there's a directive to reform a whole series of copyright laws, and one of the articles in this, called Article 13, requires anybody running a user-generated content website, if you take in content from the public, you'd have to take that and pass it through a filter provided by only a small number of companies that are out there that do this kind of thing at tremendous expense to see, does this violate anybody's copyright of what came before? And these copyright violation databases are legion for having lots of fake kind of claims about copyrights on things and for having really poor matches, because it's all AI, which is all probabilistic, right? And so lots of false negatives, lots of false positives. But the law would stipulate that if you put something up that you didn't pass through a filter like this, and you didn't take it down within an hour of getting a notice from a copyright holder, you'd be liable for huge fines. And that would immediately shut down, first off, it would immediately shut down any European competitor to the social networks out there, right? But it would also hurt, I think, some of the vibrancy and creativity and fun of the internet. It would demolish fair use rights, which are still rights that you have as citizens to be able to create derivative works of a lot of this data, abolish academic and other like newsworthy related uses of this data. So regulations can certainly go too far in the other directions. That's really tough to get right. And I think CDA 230, which is what that was, I think struck the right balance at the time. But I think the platforms took advantage of that to try to pretend to say there's no obligation on our part. In fact, we can't police this. We can't, be conveners and good party hosts, because otherwise we get in trouble.
They'll almost always say, like, you'll hear this defense from them all the time. You don't want us to be the ministry of truth. But the dirty secret they're hiding is that they already are, right? Like their algorithms already decide the things that you see from whom. So they're making a choice. And then the question is, do you want the things you see to be hooked up to their business model, which doesn't care about like morality, it's just going to do the thing that gets the most clicks and the most time? Or do you want to have a conversation about values, about what kinds of things we want to have?
I think if we could take the tens of millions or hundreds of millions that'll be spent on regulations or coming up with these fancy approaches and funding Wikipedia and Snopes, we might make a bigger dent on keeping false information from spreading.
So we have 6.5 minutes left. I want to tackle 3 more of these questions, which thank you so much for both being here, for engaging with us, for submitting these questions. They've been fantastic. Because this specific question is a good transition. We've talked about what consumers can do. We've talked a little bit about what regulators can do. But Renee, you raised the point about the engineers. And certainly backstage, we were talking about shame is a fantastic motivator. And during the Delete Uber campaign, Asa, you had mentioned that it didn't really hurt Uber's finances, but it made it kind of uncool to work there. Yep. And so this question from someone in the audience is, how can we reconcile tech's narrative of representing the world's, quote, best and brightest, end quote, With the lack of diversity, what is the relationship between this dynamic and so many misses, be they generated by optimism or ignorance? So I think this is really about the role that engineers play, the folks who are actually building and modifying and tweaking these algorithms. I'm just curious to hear what you guys think about that.
Okay. I think that some of it comes from one thing that I'm always amazed by is that people don't see, like they're not thinking about all the different ways that something can break, or people I believe like this is normal have a sense of self and maybe like some degree of like degrees of freedom where they can envision what other people are thinking or feeling, but. I remember the conversation about harassment as someone who has been doxxed and has been harassed, and I don't think there's a single woman on the internet who hasn't had that experience. Back in like 2014, 2015, when Twitter inadvertently gave my home address to a bunch of stalkers as part of a DMCA takedown gone wrong, and then I had to deal with the fallout from that, which was a colossal pain in the ass. There were women who were saying, your systems are a disaster. Your platform is a disaster. Back in 2014, and they were summarily ignored until it became an issue for celebrities and journalists and white men. And then all of a sudden, the conversation, the pendulum kind of swung. But there were a lot of people who were saying, like, we tried really hard to explain what was happening here and nobody listened. And I would go and I would sit down with the engineering teams and you would really have to like work hard to find a woman on the team where you're like, when recently Jack said like, oh, we have this great idea, we're gonna let people know when you're online on Twitter. and like every woman on Twitter was like, who the hell wants that? So I think that some of it is just like a perception thing, or when Google's new AI voice, when they did their voice test and the AI didn't identify itself and it sounded like a young girl saying like and like and with a vocal fry and the whole bit. And in the tech groups I was in, the women were like, what the hell was that? And were there any women on the team saying like, what the hell is going on here?
Right.
So I think that's where you start to see that the value of diversity is having those perspectives that kind of let you see where this might go or head off just from the internalized experience that they have had as users of the internet.
Right.
That I think is sometimes lacking.
That's a really good point.
I was just going to say, I think there's a big demarcation or a big difference between developers working inside of companies, kind of where the tension and the struggle around what they build is largely internal, not exposed to the outside world. It gets bubbled out by proxy through people like Jack and others who can be very remote from the end users. Difference between that and open source software, where the line between the people using the software and the people writing it is sometimes zero, right? And there's great scales of gray between those. And there the questions of diversity and representation and perspectives are laid out in the open, sometimes to great effect, sometimes in a really challenging way. Over the weekend, Linus Torvalds announced that he was taking a break from releasing a new version of the Linux kernel and taking a couple, it's not even clear how long, a couple weeks, potentially a couple months off from this thing that's defined him for 27 years, because he's recognized that his ability to communicate and grow that community was a communication style that was very gruff, that was not very empathic, that he saw most debates as being about technically the right and wrong ways to do it, and he would call you an idiot and much worse, and he was called out on that. And finally, he kind of dawned on him that this was limiting his ability to manage that community and his ability and really the strength of the Linux community. And so he posted something publicly and has pulled back from that. And I think it's a kind of a realization a lot of people in the open source community are going through. How can we look at how we're building code and change those behaviors, those communication styles, the tools we use, the ways that we talk to bringing those users into being developers to build better software by being more diverse.
Yeah. We have, I'm sorry, let me jump to the last. We have 2 questions left. We have 1 minute and 37 seconds.
One-word answers.
Yes.
Speed round.
Is there a safe browser? Go.
Yes.
Which one?
Mozilla.
Done.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are we in agreement?
Yep.
Okay.
And I'll give due credit to Safari for also doing a lot to kind of...
And Brave is also pretty good.
Yeah.
Brave does thing.
All right. So with 1 minute left, maybe not just one word, but maybe one sentence. How have algorithms hijacked your energy, time, and other resources by keeping you on screen unnecessarily? And have you developed personal habits, rules, or tricks to redeem your sovereignty? Brian?
How have algorithms changed?
I think maybe if you could tell us one habit, rule, or trick, we'll get through the whole panel.
I don't even know where to really start with that. I mean, I'm ruled by my inbox, my email inbox, as I'm sure most people are. I mean, Twitter and Facebook feeds are kind of distractions when I want them. But no, I don't have much technique other than I'd like to do what my friend Larry Lessig did at one point, which is declare email bankruptcy. Email everybody who had sent him email in his inbox going, is this still relevant? Do you still need me? And then like deleting them all, right? And he got back 30 responses and he was able to answer those in 3 hours and he hit inbox 0. And it was like glorious, apparently. Love to see that happen.
Nice. That's a good one. Renee?
I think my biggest vice is probably Twitter. I really like Twitter despite all the things that are wrong with it. I've gotten much more proactive at like muting threads. Oh, I turned off notifications on Twitter. I don't have a red dot. I only go to it when I decide I'm gonna. I go to it a lot, but I don't have the notification of the red dot. Yeah, it doesn't push anything to me.
Nice.
Well, the obvious answer is yes, totally. Twitter and email are mine. And I discovered, especially when I'm emotionally down, then it's like it sucks way more of my time. So a couple of things that I do, I turn my screen to grayscale, which just removes some of like the visual sugar. Then the other one that I delete the apps and I just go to their websites on my phone. And then the last one is I ended up writing a thing for myself. And so, it's well known in Silicon Valley that the faster your page loads, like the greater your retention. In fact, Amazon famously found that for every 100 milliseconds that their page loads slower, they lose 1% of revenue. So I was like, cool, we can like harness this. So I wrote a little thing. So all it looks is like how long I've been scrolling on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And the longer I've been scrolling, the slower things load, but randomly. And so I find I get really annoyed at it after a couple scrolls and I go do something else.
Fantastic.
Like being on an airplane.
Yeah, totally.
I will say that for me, my wife and I have actively chosen not to put any of our children's pictures on Facebook. So we have a private group where only our actual relatives are there who refuse to get pictures by email, and that's been one little bit of sanity. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank this fantastic panel for educating all of us through this conversation. And it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you. So thank you so much. We hope you will come back to Chronicle Chats. If you want to support the fantastic journalism that we do day in and day out, please consider, if you aren't already a subscriber, that's sfchronicle.com/subscribe. And if you guys, I don't know if you want to still hang out for a little bit and answer some questions, but we'll be here. So time check for Stacy. How long do we have before you kick us out? Less than an hour. Okay. All right. So we'll be here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.